It's like in school. The first rows are all.
Ladies and gentlemen, can everyone hear me all right? Okay, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Mirat Mabrouk. I'm the Deputy Director and Director of Research and Programs for the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. Thank you for joining us for the launch of this very important and very timely report. Now, for the past several decades, Libya has been a fertile breeding and recruiting ground for global extremist ideology. And this important report, authored by Jason Pack, Rhiannon Smith, and Karim Mizran, looks at three factors in this issue. First of all, it looks at the origins and percussors of ISIS. Secondly, it examines them in a broader political context. And thirdly, it offers concrete advice for Western governments on how to tackle this threat. Now, that's important because this threat is evolving constantly. Libya is part of a global network that covers Afghanistan, Iraq, North Africa, and Europe. In fact, the Manchester bomber, Salman Abdi, came out of this network. And when you consider this, it's important that you take a look at the Rafiq Hariri Center's earlier work and constant work on Libya, led by Dr. Mizran, which says that it is impossible to simply consider a military strategy for Libya's issues. So again, thank you so much for joining us. If you, this event is being webcast. If you want to ask questions on Twitter, I'm told that the hashtags are AC Mideast and AC Libya. And we would, by the way, we would like to gratefully acknowledge the support of Eye on ISIS, without which publication of this report would not have been possible. And we also owe a huge debt of gratitude to Associate Director Alyssa Miller, who labored tirelessly to make sure that you could get your hands on this report today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mirat, for this introduction, for your words, and thanks for the Atlantic countries and the staff's work on organizing this event. Thanks to all of you for being with us this afternoon to talk and discuss this important report. I'd like to thank Jason and Rhiannon for their collaboration, and of course Chris for having taken the time off from his very busy schedule to come here and comment on the report and participate to this discussion. I would like to start right away, if possible, so that we can get directly through the presentation, and after that have enough time for questions and answers, because we all agree that the most important thing is the interaction and the dynamic relationship that is between us and the public, so that we can stay not only on ISIS and the history of ISIS, but also move on. What is Libya's situation? What are the difficulties of the region, and so on. I would like to start. I will be asking questions to our co-authors and to the commentator, and then at the end of it, we will pass to the questions and answer. Jason Pack, Jason, I would like to start with you. Jason is a unique case of a scholar, a practitioner, a thinker. For his position, he has been a PhD candidate in history at Cambridge. and at the same time he's the director of the United States Libya Business Association, so he has incredible ties with the commercial world and has to analyze and discuss the economics of the situation, while at the same time having the background to understand the history and the politics of the evolution of the country. I'd like to ask you, Jason, why did you create Eye on ISIS? And why is the information and the insights that you present in Eye on ISIS unique and so important as we all know they are?
Good afternoon, everyone, and obviously a joy to be here with you again, Kareem. It's a quarterly happening, I feel, being up here on this stage. And yeah, why did I create Eye on ISIS? Maybe I regretting it most of the days, but not now. I certainly didn't do it for the money or the glory, but possibly I did it to prevent another Morning Glory-like episode, but this time with jihadists trying to smuggle oil into the Med. So, joking aside, this was my attempt to give back to Libya by founding a charity which would promulgate accurate and up-to-the-moment information about the Islamic State in Libya. So on the one hand, the idea of creating the website and founding a nonprofit came out of my consulting business and my business background, which Kareem very kindly mentioned. And the reason for that is that my team, Rian and some others who I see in the room now, would become expert at producing Libya monitoring reports. And therefore, we were sitting on thousands of pages of reports about the security threats every week from the revolution until the present. And yet, on the other hand, Eye on ISIS was a response, or as my team and I call it, EOIL, that's the acronym, to market demand. So to give you a little sense of all this, I'll tell you the backstory behind Eye on ISIS. Since 2011, I've really been responding to the gap in the Libya field. In other words, people would contact me for information, and what they wanted to know changed over time. In 2011, I can recall distinctly, pretty much every question was an iteration of who are the rebels. Then in 2012, 2013, with the GNC election, everyone wanted to know about market entry or due diligence on specific Libyan businessmen. Then as 2013 and the political isolation law began to be a big issue, it was who are the militia leaders, how are they connected to each other? Then I can recall vividly the 2014-2015 period. Everyone wanted to know about the Tobruk-Tripoli split. Why was it deepening? Was Libya on a slow-motion train wreck, or was there a possibility to exit that bifurcation? And of course, what did that mean? It meant that market entry and due diligence requests were drying up. My consulting business was not as active in those years. And then something happened. I became associated with the shipping industry, particularly through Risk Intelligence that Ria and I work with, a Danish maritime intelligence firm. And we were cultivating accurate on-the-ground sources to deal with the threats that affect ports. But it turned out to understand what was happening at the interface between land and the sea, you needed to move on land to understand the jihadi actors who might, for example, threaten Ras Lanuf or Sidra. But when I was thinking about those shipping reports, I realized, yes, we had sources on the ground that no one else had, but the nature of the information was it was niche, and it was packaged in a way that it wouldn't be accessible to a broad audience, either government or media. So as that was evolving in my head, I remembered that the nature of questions I would be asked by media and government changed. People would ask silly things like, are there 1,000 or 2,000 jihadists in Derna? Or why is the Abu Salim Martyrs Brigade fighting ISIS? And my response would be, I'm not an expert on jihadi groups. I'm really interested in business and politics. But the questions kept rolling in. And then I remember one day in mid-2015, it was a journalist, maybe from The Guardian, maybe from the FT. So if you can't tell me, Jason, how many jihadists are in CERT, please direct me to the greatest expert on the Islamic State in Libya. And I racked my brain, and I realized we're in a small field. Kareem and I know the only 10 white people, as well as Arabs, who might be able to answer a question like that. And it dawned on me there was no expert on the Islamic State in Libya. There were experts on jihadist groups, and there were experts on Libyan Islamists, but really scant knowledge about ISIS, and it wasn't present all in one area. So surveying this gap, that's what made me want to create Eye on ISIS. to provide a comprehensive and reliable source of easily searchable English language information to tell the story of the Islamic State and other jihadi actors, how they interacted, how they grew over time. And it's great to look over the audience and to see so many members of my team that have helped me. And what we tried to do is to synthesize this information. And in a way, this report is the culmination of the Eye on ISIS project, because what the report does is it derives from the existing literature on ISIS. It mines open sources, so tweets and Arabic social media and articles and peer-reviewed scholarship. But most crucially, it draws on human source interviews with Libyans who have been living this experience since the 2011 uprisings. So if you go on the Eye on ISIS website, you see that the posts are categorized into 4 categories: ISIS in action, other jihadi actors, Western response, and the anti-ISIS coalition. And going back to 2014, since before there was ISIS, we try to narrate what has happened each week in Libyan history in those 4 categories. It's true that the actual sources from which this information comes needs to be anonymous because our Libyan sources require their safety to operate. And to distill, these 20, 30,000 pages of information, these think tank reports draw analyzable lessons, like what should Western policy be as a result of the eviction of ISIS from Sirte? What does it mean that ISIS could first operate in a city that had been very anti-Gaddafi, like Derna, but then transition to a city that was Gaddafi's heartland, like Sirte? And we draw out these lessons in other publications, 2 that Ree has been very instrumental in at Hate Speech International, a Norwegian think tank. The one is called Who Pays for ISIS in Libya, where we deal with the financing aspect. For example, debunking the myth that ISIS used Libyan oil to fund itself. That's, of course, bogus. ISIS never used any oil revenue to finance itself. And then one that's come out recently, mapping Libya's jihadists. So to sum up, Kareem, you asked, why is the Eye on ISIS information unique? I would say that's because it derives from Libyan sources, not just open sources. But yet, Ree and I and Brett and Nate Mason, who we see here, have vetted this information. And then it's unique because it's dynamically searchable. And so, for example, you click on the interactive timelines to find out what was happening in June 2015. And then it has maps about how these jihadi groups have moved over Libya over time. And then I think the researcher or the government analyst can ask the data set questions. You can test the hypothesis against the data. And for me, this is an example of how scholarship should be going. Rather than a traditional book, which you read in a linear fashion, Eye on ISIS is more like what I would say a choose-your-own-adventure story, where depending on what suits you and what you're looking for, you read it in a different way. So I see this as kind of a model of how we could collate and organize complex information moving forward.
It also gives you the possibility to look at how these groups evolve and how these groups morph from something to something else. Regarding ISIS, but more in general, jihadism in Libya, since you have been following it more or less since the beginning, how do you see they have evolved? How do you see, has there been an evolution or involution? Has there been a mutation in the way they are organized, in the way they act, in the way they preach, in the way they recruit, in the way they act on the ground in time?
This is a very sharp question, Kareem. I think that jihadi groups are different from other political actors, for example, Arab nationalist movements, which are largely dying in the Arab world, or the monarchies, which are embattled in some ways and not in others. The jihadist groups evolve faster. And this is something that the more I've thought about them and the more I've studied them, I believe it is intrinsic. Jihadi groups mutate over time, just as HIV or a retrovirus. But its genius is its constant mutation. And now when we look at the Libyan reality, we realize that there are no sharp boundaries between the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, LIFG, or between Ansar al-Sharia, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or ISIS. And this mutability and kind of flexibility has been proven again and again. But to use an example, look at the Manchester and London attacks and particularly if you look at the London attack, Salman al-Ubaidi, he was, of course, raised in Manchester in a LIFG milieu. And that's an al-Qaeda-linked group that was founded in Afghanistan to initially fight against the Soviets, but also to overthrow Gaddafi. People would say, oh, but how could he gravitate to an ISIS group if he was raised within al-Qaeda theology? No, that's the exact opposite way you should be looking at it. Analysts have tended to give too much credence to the agitprop and pronouncements of the various groups, which stress their ideological and political distinctions. The fact is that these groups are all connected, and it's really easy to jump from one another. I'll make an analogy here. It's not like baseball teams, where it's quite difficult to be a Yankees fan and a Red Sox fan. Those are mutually exclusive. So even though you like baseball, it's difficult to jump from one another. I think it's more like being a wine lover. So you appreciate Loire Sauvignon Blancs, but then you have some tastings and you realize that you like New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs. So it's pretty easy to change your allegiance because your palate is opened. And that's something that has not really been drawn out in the literature about jihadi groups, how once you get into the idea of the struggle against the West.
No, what has been, sorry to interrupt you, that's why I asked you this question, just to define exactly this point, that there is blurred borders within this group.
Correct.
There is not an organized complicity.
Correct.
It's not that ISIS is the last of a part of a big conspiracy plot that started from the Muslim Brotherhood and then moved into the Libyan fighting group and then the Ansar Sharia, and they're all connected and they're all organized. Because that's part of a narrative that we have to debunk, I think. So it's important to say, yes, it's easy to move from one to the other, but that doesn't mean that there is an organized complicity or an organized structure between these various groups.
Right. So this is where the New Zealand versus Loire Valley Sauvignon Blanc analogy falls apart, because the grapes in one bottle are from place A and from the other bottle in place B. No, when you look at these jihadi groups, most of the people who are active don't understand the theology of the jihadi group that they belong to. And therefore, they can't tell you, oh, I'm a member of Ansar Sharia because I don't believe in the notion of imama put forth by ISIS. No, far from it. There's a hodgepodge ideologically and socially, and people pull stuff out of it. So there's this mistaken belief that Karim and I are debunking, which is that ISIS is different from al-Qaeda because ISIS is wedded to territoriality and al-Qaeda is wedded to a kind of, cell structure and takfiri ideology without governing. This is not really true. And I think that this myth has led to the idea that evicting ISIS from Sirte, as happened in late 2016, led to the quote-unquote defeating of ISIS in Libya. That's absolutely false, because ISIS mutated to become governable, and it derived unique capacities to administer Libya, and that was because Libya was an ungoverned space. So it just mutated to find its environment. And this is because ISIS is like all jihadi movements before it. It has something intrinsic which changes and mutates to its environment. I'll toss a little overview theologically, because we don't talk enough about the theology of these groups. And, from Afghani to Rashid Ridda to Sayyid Qutb to, all of these jihadi ideologues now, what they're reacting against is the dominance from, the closing of the gates of ijtihad until the 19th century of the ulama within Sunni Islam. So jihadi theology wants to empower the individual to make his own ijtihad. And once the individual is empowered, he's empowered to mutate it however he wants. And he's not pinned down to, following like a Shia might do, a given marja taqlid. So inherently, jihadi organization eschews formal hierarchies, and it even eschews accountability, preferring cell-like structures which can mutate over time. And this constant evolution allows some groups to have more command and control structures than others. So ISIS does have more command and control structures probably than al-Qaeda. But I like to look at jihadi groups as a conglomeration of franchises. And I learned this from Aaron Zellin, who's helped a lot in our project. Each jihadi only pledges his allegiance to his commander. Only through that commander does he pledge to a larger unit. And this is why the question of having a personalized bi'ah to bin Laden or Baghdadi or Abu Nabil al-Anbari, that's really important. And now, if you think of it like that, you can see how that's just like militia structure in Libya. Because the militias are all local and you're a Misratan, and you're connected to Misrata in this way, and you don't really care that it's connected to Libya Dawn, to be honest. You're just doing it because of your local neighborhood commander. So loyalty is at the local level, and this is particularly strengthened by the Libyan context. So now to come back to some examples of mutation. Libya and ISIS moved into Derna in 2014, and then from Derna to Sirte. Now, as I alluded to earlier, the tribal situation and the relationship to the former regime are literally opposites in those two places. And yet ISIS mutated to embed itself in these different environments. And yes, it didn't work so well in Derna, and Rhea is going to comment later about how that played out. But when ISIS found itself in Sirte, where there was even less governance, it realized that the people wanted governance. They wanted, trash collection and small business licenses and all of that. And all of a sudden, ISIS mutated to have those things. And I think that ISIS's attempt at territoriality was also a mutation to the fact that the Libyan state had no sovereignty. So there was a gap in territoriality. And that's exactly, of course, how ISIS was founded in Syria. The Assad regime had lost its sovereign capacity. So to grasp the future evolution of jihadi actors in Libya, I assert that we need to study their origins and the potentialities contained within those origins. And when you look at the data of the ISIS set, you see that there are a tremendous amount of connections with the Levant. People go back and forth, response to statelessness. And to use this evolution analogy, what if we look at those things as selection pressures? One jihadi group is evolving this way, and another evolves the other way. But the one who has mutated to best deal with the challenges, be they tribal or sovereignty, in the environment that he's serving in, he's the one that survives. And there's a lot of churn and burn with jihadis. So that allows this mutability and constant shifting. And no doubt those ISIS fighters who fled Sirte and are in the south, they are going to have new selection pressures of how to deal with Tuareg and Tebu, how to deal with smuggling routes, and that's going to be different than governing in Sirte. And they're going to be selected for the ones who can cut it.
Good, very interesting. Let's continue along these lines. What studying ISIS in Libya has taught you about ISIS in other regions, and more general, the phenomenon of jihadism in the various areas?
Yeah, thank you, Kareem, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I think so, as Jason mentioned, we are studying day in, day out what ISIS and other jihadi groups are doing in Libya. We've obviously put a lot of effort and research into this report. And I think a lot of the key findings from this report have actually a direct impact and will help to understand what ISIS is doing in other countries, how their strategy might change as they try to deal with the setbacks in Raqqa and Mosul, and what they might do next, and how we can deal actually with this threat. So I'm just going to outline three of the key findings from this report that I think will shed a light on this. So the first key finding that we have is that it's actually statelessness that created ISIS in Libya. So ISIS, its ability to emerge in Libya, and its ability to sort of embed itself within the jihadist groups already there, it stems from, it's a symptom rather of Libya's problems rather than being the cause. So many of the problems that Libya has faced since 2011, so problems with governance, lack of institutions, lack of security, the role that militias play in really directing policy and what is going on, it's that chaos, that instability, that lack of governance, which Jason previously touched upon, which allowed ISIS to really gain a foothold. And we saw this in Derna, which is where some of the Libyan jihadi fighters who've been overseas in Iraq and Syria came back. They then pledged allegiance to Baghdadi. And in Derna, they were able to gain a foothold there, mainly because under Gaddafi, Derna was a city that was very much isolated. It was marginalized. A lot of the jihadi groups were able to, they had a strong presence there. There was a very weak central state, and therefore these ISIS fighters were able to sort of infiltrate this and make a lot of, as we touched on before, the blurred lines between many of the groups. However, our second key finding, which I think is also relevant for how ISIS may, what the downfall of ISIS may be, certainly in Libya, is that actually ISIS's techniques, their brutality, the sheer amount of violence and the way they show violence for it to be public rather than sort of a means to an end, I think is something particularly un-Libyan, and there's been a significant reaction against that in Libya. So our research shows that ISIS is not at all popular in Libya. The majority of Libyans do not support ISIS. And one of the key reasons for that is this level of brutality. There are other reasons. Obviously the reason that ISIS was able to gain a lot of leverage in places like the Levant is some of the sectarian divisions which don't exist in Libya. So that has made it more difficult. But I think this is particularly relevant in Derna. So we saw this group, and like I say, there are many other Al-Qaeda linked groups, Ansar Sharia, who have very similar ideologies, similar, you would imagine, levels of violence. But actually, the levels that ISIS went to, so the beheading of Christians, the crucifixions, this type of thing was very out of skew with actually what Libyans have been doing. And eventually this led to a backlash against them, so they assassinated a lot of the sort of local leaders. And actually the Darnawis, although they were also jihadist groups, said, no, this isn't, we don't want this. And they were able to drive them out of the city within about 6 months. And I think that is a very relevant point, and it also touches on something else, I think, inherent in the Libyan situation, but I suspect applies elsewhere, in that Libyan jihadism is really driven from, or the majority of times, sort of Libyan concerns. So even in Derna now, the groups there are not really, what's driving them is not to turn Libya into an Islamic state. Sure, they have very, Salafist, often Takfiri ideology, but actually what they are concerned about at this time is defeating Haftar. Their concerns are purely, or majority of the time, local, and this was something that actually wasn't what ISIS was about, and that's, I think, one of the reasons.
Can it also be, sorry to interrupt you,
Of course.
Can it also be the fact that the essence of ISIS is foreign to the Libyan?
That's actually, I was just going to come to that point. I think that's exactly right. So I think anyone who knows Libya knows that I think there's a strong dislike of foreign interference, or the idea of foreign interference in Libya. And although, yes, you have groups like Ansar Sharia who are linked to Al-Qaeda and others, but these have very much been more, I would say, bottom-up Libyan groups. You didn't have so much, when ISIS set up in Libya, they had various people from the sort of headquarters in Raqqa and Mosul coming over, setting up. They set up administration. They had a whole way of doing social media. It was very much something that was, to an extent, planted from outside. And I think this is another thing that, this is not a Libyan organization. These are not Libyan ways of doing things. For a long time, a lot of Libyans you would speak to would not even admit that any of the ISIS fighters were Libyan. So I think this has certainly had a big impact as well within the Libyan context.
And that will, you think that will help us also to understand, as we were talking about with Jason, how the jihadism is evolving in Libya, and what is the future of ISIS in a sense? Because now that they are out of theater, if these dynamics are there, there is no future for ISIS. But as Jason was saying, it's mutated into something else. So how do you see?
Well, I think
the post-Sirte.
Yes. Well, I think the danger with that is, so I guess to come back to our sort of one of the other main findings is the idea that it's marginalization. So somewhere like Sirte, which had no real history of jihadism under Gaddafi, it was obviously his hometown, it benefited a lot from infrastructure development, that flipped on its head post-2011. It was, ravaged by war, and it was very much neglected by the authorities. It was a front line more than once. And one of the reasons ISIS was able to gain a foothold there is mainly because there was no resistance there. There was no one really to stop them, and also a lot of the people there, well, maybe this is going to be better, and maybe at least, as Jason mentioned, there will be some state-like functions. I think what the danger is that now that ISIS has lost that territoriality, that the West thinks we can, or sit back and say, okay, well, ISIS are out, they haven't got any territory, this is fine, they're not a threat anymore. But the whole reason that ISIS became a threat to begin with is that they are able to mutate. As we know in the Libya field, many different militias and factions mutate all the time. This is how things sort of stay alive. You switch allegiances, depending on priorities and how the political situation changes. So I think there's a real danger that if the sort of current political developments that are going on, if conflict breaks out again around Sirte, it will become a no man's land again, which is already, it's slightly improving now, but essentially that's what it is. No one really controls it. And if that happens, there are still fighters to the south of Sirte. We don't know what's going to happen in Iraq and other places if fighters do fall back to Libya, or if it's simply a place to kind of regroup and rechange strategies, maybe perhaps launch bigger, more spectacular attacks, then I think that's a real danger, because those conditions are still there.
I agree.
Can I jump in on this one?
Sure.
So I think this is a classic point where looking at the history of how ISIS ended up in Sirte is going to tell us about the dangers for the future and what we need to prepare against. So a little potted history is that Sirte was one of the last holdouts of the pro-Gaddafi forces. It fell on October 20th, 2011. And it was dominated by the victorious Misratan militias, who imposed a new tyranny, essentially. And it went from a Gaddafian tyranny to a Misratan tyranny. And the Misratan victors didn't play nice with the local population, with the Kavadifa, with the Furjan, with the Warfallah around there. And what do you know? Ansar al-Sharia presented itself as an anti-Misratan force, and therefore many locals, although they might not have been jihadists, were willing to work with Ansar al-Sharia in 2013, 2014 to try to evict the Misratans. And after posing as the liberators, then there was a new jihadi tyranny, an Ansar Sharia tyranny of various pockets and neighborhoods. And Ansar Sharia needed to weaponize itself, so a lot of its fighters defected to ISIS once that was growing in 2014 in the Levant. And they got the media toolkit, and they got the training, and they went back and forth. And when those groups were cannibalized, the Ansar Sharia groups were cannibalized by ISIS, the same dynamic of the statelessness vacuum allowing the jihadis to operate was in play. So if we fast forward to the establishment of the GNA, Government of National Accord government, and then Sarraj finally working with the Misratans and U.S. airstrikes to liberate Sirte, and Banyan Marsus being the vehicle through which Sirte is liberated, they didn't establish governance. It's not like Banyan Marsus has learned how to govern Sirte. In fact, Sirte is a battleground between Haftar and Misrata, and it is the epitome of the vacuum in Libya, that kicking one group out doesn't allow the central government to function there. So I see that it's not just that ISIS has been able to flee Sirte, because they weren't routed there. There was no siege of Sirte. So the top fighters merely slipped out to the desert because the attacks were announced before they came. But if Sirte remains ungoverned, a new cycle could exist whereby yet another Misratan victory allows for a kind of tyranny, and the local population will be willing to work with jihadi actors again to kick out either Misrata or Haftar. I mean, it's kind of tragic that we can see this cycle coming, and we could be talking about a new jihadi group controlling Sirte in 2018.
Hopefully not. Chris,
Kareem.
what do you think about the report? Or about all we've been talking about?
Sure.
What your
No, I mean,
experience?
I think a lot of the important issues have been raised. I had the chance to read the report over pretty thoroughly this morning, and I think it has a lot to commend itself. There are, a number of important points that are made. I mean, I think the discussion of the origins of jihadism in Libya 25 years ago, long before we'd ever heard of ISIS and before most people had even heard of Al-Qaeda, is a valuable contribution. I think the explanation of the role of the jihadists in the revolution is very well done, and understanding that is certainly important to understanding the role that jihadists play, or what motivates them in Libya today. I think that the report accurately depicts a shifting jihadist milieu in Libya, which is an important point that's made. I mean, we're here talking about ISIS because this is an issue that is important in Washington, but ISIS is really only one of several different jihadist actors of varying shades of lethality, of varying shades of locality in Libya itself. And I think the report makes a contribution in stressing that fact. It also clearly, and this is a point that has been a sort of longstanding one for me, it clearly outlines how the failure of post-conflict reconstruction in Libya after 2011, in particular in the, I think you would say in the initial months of 2012, led to what Regis called statelessness. And this opened the door for all these jihadist groups, including ISIS, to emerge in Libya. And then, in addition, it also stresses the local political grievances and the role that they play as a driver. But I think that overall, one of the things perhaps that I like most about the way in which it describes the ISIS situation in Libya is that even while it stresses the role of local political grievances, it also clearly outlines the role that ISIS has played as an agent of jihadism within Libya. We oftentimes tend to think about the growth of jihadist groups, the growth of ISIS in particular, as something that's either driven entirely by local grievances, that's one side of the debate, or on the other side of the debate, something that's entirely driven by ISIS masters in Raqqa. And the reality is that you need both, that this is a question in political science or social science terms of structure and agency. You have structural factors in Libya, including long-standing local grievances, political and economic grievances, ideological currents, statelessness, all of which contribute to a milieu in which ISIS is able to thrive. But it thrives not only for those reasons, but in particular because ISIS in Raqqa decided to target it and actively sought to build a second front in Libya, as is well described in the report. And I think that's important from a policy perspective because it suggests, at least to me, that there are both political, certainly, things that need to be done in order to deal with this problem, but also that there is a role for the military. That it's not a question of one or the other, that somehow you need to figure out how to use both in a way that is effective and does not undermine the broader objectives that you're trying to achieve. So I think that's that was, for me, was a strong takeaway from the report. There are a couple things that, and this isn't really a criticism of the report because it's a report focused on ISIS, but I sort of wondered why there wasn't more discussion of them. One is Al-Qaeda. I mean, it came up already here, but I was surprised not to see more discussion of Al-Qaeda. Obviously, it's a report on ISIS, so that's not a very fair criticism. But there is this question of what the relationship between the two groups is, how they differ. That's something that I think is important to bear in mind. And then and this is more of a personal interest, is the Russia angle. To what extent Russia is positioned to help or hurt with this particular problem. At the end of the report, I think one of the main policy recommendations or the policy framework that's taken is for a bottom-up approach to dealing with Libya's current political fracture. I think that's a sensible approach. It's a really hard one to do right. The reality is that our national security apparatus in the United States and allied countries isn't really designed to do a lot of coordinated local work without a lot more experience and a lot more resources than we currently have. States like to work with states. And that's been one of our big challenges in Libya so far, is that as a state, we have difficulty working with a stateless country like Libya. It's obviously not only Libya. But the challenge is, even though the bottom-up approach, I think there's a good logic for it, there are obvious challenges there. And I'm not saying that you don't recognize those. I just underscoring them. A lot of good, sensible recommendations on capacity building in Libya, continuing security force assistance, doing some economic reconstruction. There are a number of things, obviously, that are clearly laid out in the final chapter that I think are good. However, and it occurred to me, actually, that I think that a lot of people who follow Libya are sort of on the same page about the importance of doing broader state building, broader political reconstruction, whether you take the bottom-up strategy or a top-down strategy or some combination. I think everyone agrees on some level that the ultimate solution, if there is one, to the problem of jihadism and ISIS in Libya is basically state building on some level. And I think most people who have been looking at this closely agree. People say it in different ways, but there's sort of an agreement about that. But the problem that we face, and this is the policy dilemma that the United States has been in over the course of the last couple of years when it comes to Libya, is that there are lots of reasons not to do state building in Libya. It's really hard. It's really expensive. We have a lot of other priorities in the world that are in the headlines, a heck of a lot more than Libya is. And we have lots and lots of naysayers, both in Washington and in allied capitals, who tell us that state building from the outside is basically impossible. So even though within the expert policy community following Libya, there's a general consensus that this is what needs to happen, the policy direction is basically, there are huge hurdles and obstacles to actually implementing what I think many people would agree is necessary to deal with ISIS and other jihadist groups, not to mention help the humanitarian situation, the migration problem, and all the other problems that are emanating from Libya right now. So the dilemma, though, is that ISIS, as a result, doesn't go away. So we do occasional military interventions. We do airstrikes and other kinds of things in order to try and control the problem. And I think that's a necessary thing to do, given that we're not likely right now to do a whole lot more. We have to do something to hold these groups in check. But of course, the problem is, the more of that external military intervention that we do without state building, the more we push off the longer-term solution to the problem. And we may be sort of condemning ourselves to a perpetual state of disorder in this country. And this is a policy dilemma that I think really needs to be tackled head-on. It's one that the last few years of foreign governments looking at Libya have yet to solve. It's one that I don't see any solutions for coming out of Washington or other capitals right now. You never know, one might emerge, but it's one that I think ultimately, if we're going to deal with ISIS and the other problems in Libya, we got to deal with this fundamental dilemma.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. There's the international situation that is complicating the things enormously, and it's changing. As you're talking about the Russians, now we have the ostracism versus Qatar, and the incredible interference of the Egyptians and the Emirates, and it's if at all it's not decreasing, it's expanding the foreign interference into the area. Thank you very much. Let's conclude on the U.S. policy, Jason. What do you think that, after all this observation, U.S. counter-terror efforts, U.S. foreign policy should be? I know that's science fiction at this point, given the way the administration is going. But.
Well, Chris hit all the key points, and I think he distilled the 10 recommendations of the paper down as well, or better than I could have. And if I had to make it a bullet point, I'd say a purely counter-terror approach to ISIS in Libya is insufficient. And then I would amplify one thing that Chris said, maybe even stressing it more, which is that it is impossible to defeat ISIS globally if it is not defeated in Libya. And this is something I think that is not grasped not only by this administration, but by actors in Europe and across the globe. In other words, imagine there is V in L Day, Victory in the Levant Day, June 2018, Raqqa is liberated, the last blah, 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 blah happens. But Libya is still in the mess that it's in now. These jihadi actors will reconstitute themselves in Libya. And this is something that Libya is different than say, Nigeria. If you don't defeat Boko Haram, but you do win in the Levant and Libya, Boko Haram is not a place where the most important jihadi actors from the Levant can nest themselves and thrive and reemerge again in the Levant. No, Libya is unique because of its historic connections to global jihadism, particularly Darna. So that's the biggest take-home point. And I want to just very quickly hit some smaller things about what we learned in this report and how this reflects on U.S. counterterror policy. So again, and both Ree and Chris have hit on this, targeted capacity building programs are needed to fill the power vacuum which was exploited by ISIS. Ree said it, ISIS is the symptom, not the cause. The underlying disease is statelessness, lack of governance. However, and now I would try to address the dilemma that Chris pointed out, which is that there is no appetite in Washington, London, Paris, or Rome for nation-building assistance writ large. I think what we're getting at is that you don't need nation-building assistance writ large. You need small injections of targeted capacity-building programs, which empower Libyan actors themselves to fill vacuums. And without those vacuums, the jihadists can't nest. So I think the United States should be wary, as it has been, of becoming too embroiled in a complex environment. And that's something that Obama and now the new Trump administration have gotten right, but they haven't engaged enough. And we can say it, we can call a spade, which is that since 2011, both the Obama administration and the Trump administration turned their back on Libya. And that has not been targeted capacity building of the kind that we are discussing. What they've engaged in is narrowly defined counterterror, meaning assassination and airstrikes, and that's not going to be enough. However, to transition, because, point and counterpoint for the Hegelian synthesis here, I think that a military component is required. I would like to, and our research shows the veracity of the approach of continuing limited special forces deployments. So rather than a big footprint, train and equip kind of mission, which failed horribly. I mean, you guys know what happened in Cambridge and the famous pasta riots in Italy. So train and equip missions don't work with Libyans for a whole range of reasons. We could have a whole panel on that. But given the situation, you need to have these limited Western Special Forces deployments, which work alongside Libyan allies like Banyan Marsus. And that avoids the unilateral, long-term drain of these train and equip programs, which could only work if you had a national government in Libya which could vet fighters and pay for them and were a legitimate counterparty. So we're going to continue to see UK and US forces embedded with various misratans, engaging in targeteering missions, helping for reconnaissance, and they were enormously successful in the force multiplication efforts that they had from June to December 2016. So let's build on and actually continue these special forces embed things. Now I want to toss in a point which is a kind of psychological point, not a tactical point, which is the mental aspect of the Libya conflict. That's the zero-sum mentality. So we need to fight the war of ideas in Libya, and I think power sharing and decentralization a la Nate Mason, who we have here, he's really helped me contextualize that in Libya, the problem is the winner-take-all zero-sum mentality. So anything that the US and foreign actors can do to help legitimize municipal-level institutions, which are the only legitimate governance institutions in Libya, and connect together the various local councils, the business elites. Those are the institutions that have outperformed national entities in Libya. So yes, as Chris pointed out, it is difficult for huge behemoths like the bureaucratic US government to work with local councils. States prefer working with states. They need interlocutors. But you've got to see these local councils as successes to build on and not obstacles to be overcome. Another point, we've got to address the social fissures that create governance vacuums. In concert with the decentralization that I've just outlined, Libyans need to take other steps to address the social fissures which create these vacuums. So how does the West factor in here? Foreign assistance can help the establishment of transitional justice processes only if requested by the Libyans. And many of the Libyans and local councils are actually requesting this. We lack the ability to fulfill what the Libyans are asking. Some of my companies at USLBA or the government or a whole range of actors. So I want a Libyan-driven solution. I don't want a UN-imposed or US-imposed solution. It will never take root. But if the Libyans come at the local level and they say, hey, we really want to know how to administer the Zawiyan finances. We'd like to understand how we can prevent the fuel smuggling that destroys our area around Zawiya. We are going to face a real mistake if, for bureaucratic reasons, we don't provide the assistance to those counterparties who actually want our help. So, another quick bullet point. This is a complex one, but I want to tie in business and the economic situation because it's so connected to defeating ISIS. We need support for bureaucratic and fiduciary competencies, as well as things like media training for parliamentarians and local governance training. Because if Libyans can agree on this decentralized governance as a means of ending the conflict over oil revenue, foreign powers should be prepared to offer focused support and to help the implementation of that. And there is a kind of local bargain that has taken shape, not only as Haftar is advancing more and more into the West, but it was taking shape before, this kind of local bargain. So why don't we help strengthening the bureaucratic competences and fiduciary duties of the local councils? And reinvigorating our pledges for assistance, especially neglected areas. And 6, there is a sexier aspect, particularly in this capital, but also in London and Paris, for dropping bombs. But we should spend more money on economic reconstruction than we do on dropping bombs, because we need to confront the root causes of ISIS. And the US in particular, in my mind, has the ability to focus resources on economic reconstruction, confronting the black and gray markets in Libya. And we're talking about smuggling here. We're talking about the dinar rate. We have a good colleague from the IMF here. He knows. And if we can listen to these what you might call technocratic solutions rather than political solutions, we can incentivize the elimination of fuel subsidies, because it's fuel subsidies and the huge diglossia between the black market rate and the official rate of the dinar, which allow the hemorrhaging of billions of Libyan dollars and the smuggling which ends up in the coffers of the jihadists. So I'll just toss out some, things that I like. Modern commercial code, we should fund scholarship programs, vocational programs, training abroad. I know that may not be popular, but all of these things contribute to what we need to have happen. And now I'll conclude with my last pitch, because you asked about America, and it was when I was up here, I think 3 months ago, with Jonathan Weiner in March, our former special envoy to Libya and a man who I deeply respect. We had an interesting intellectual interchange. I was the one who believed that only US engagement could solve the Libya crisis. And he said, no, there's not an appetite here. We really need to coordinate European engagement. And this is a really complex issue, but I like to set the stage for our discussion by thinking that it's not the way it's conventionally presented, that the Russians, the Emiratis, and the Egyptians are all competing who can back Haftar more, and the Qataris and the Turks are thinking who can back the Islamists and Misratans more. No, it's a more nuanced problem than that. Each of these actors are trying to dominate what I call the Malif al-Libi, the Libya file. And they're nuanced. They don't just, we'll give more arms to Haftar. They're like, well, we're supporting Haftar, but let's invite Bunyan Marsus to Moscow. Let's have Siraj to Moscow. And the Emiratis gained power by bringing Haftar and Siraj together in Abu Dhabi just a month ago. So there is a game to control the mediation efforts, but only the US has the power to incentivize and disincentivize the various actors. And in the Q&A, we can talk about how the UAE-Qatar split factors into this, but America can throw down the gauntlet, if it cares to, and incentivize the parties to stop fighting, to focus on governance, and to get the Libyans on the same page about investing in the economy and oil production and undoing subsidies. And it may sound naive, but I'd like to end this rather morbid topic that we've been discussing with the idea that a virtuous cycle could be created in Libya. Libya is a virgin land with huge economic resources. It's underpopulated. And I think a virtuous cycle is possible.
Very good. Thank you very much. Chris, Lee, do you want to add something, or we just go to the Q&A?
I think Jason covered the majority of the points I would have made, so I don't know if you've got anything else.
I'm happy to talk a little bit about the policy if that's of interest. I think there are 3 basic, things here. The first is, obviously we need to continue counter-VEO, operations. That's important. There's no way that you're going to avoid that. It's going to mean airstrikes from time to time. It's going to mean training Libyan units to do, to do counter-VEO operations. That's just a fact. There's nothing we can do about that. I wish it were otherwise, but we have to continue doing that. Second of all, in our approach to the country as a whole, we have to be sure that whenever we engage, whether it's with economic assistance, with security force assistance, politically, that we are mindful of the underlying political balance in the country. Because the only way that we're going to get the overarching accord or agreement between the various different actors on the ground is when they decide that there basically is an effective balance of power, and that military action is not going to get them anything that they want. And I still think that we're not there yet. I mean, I think that the actions that we've seen of General Haftar over the course of the last few months indicate that he believes, at least on some level recently, believes that there is a potential military gains are still possible. So we have to be mindful of this underlying balance. And then third, we have to be prepared when opportunities emerge. I mean, at some point in time, that underlying political balance, will exist, or some semblance of it will exist. And at that moment, we have to be effectively ready to surge and try and do everything that we can to get the political agreement that I think many of us have been hoping for a long time.
I agree. Thank you very much. Now, to you. If there is a question, please identify yourself and take advantage of the presence of this panel to Amanda.
Thank you. Amanda Cadlick, Grand Corporation. I was curious about Special Forces assistance. How, even if it were requested, how would the United States or European actors be able to provide that kind of assistance without lending the impression of taking sides in the conflict?
Shall I go first, or you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we're already providing that assistance, and some people accuse us of taking sides, Amanda. But there's an interesting irony, which is that there are countries, and most notably France, of course, who provide special forces assistance on both sides of the Libya conflict. Right? They train Haftar and have been working with him in Benghazi in liberating various neighborhoods. But then they're also working with the Banyan Marsus and the Misratans. So it does seem, from what I understand, the US and the UK are mostly on the GNA side, Amanda. I think that when done with a very light footprint, as these things have been done until now, the international actors have not become tainted by providing this kind of assistance. In terms of if it would be ramped up massively, of course the Libyans are incredibly paranoid and don't like the idea of foreign intervention in their country, and that will become unpopular. But one of the things that's happened is there's been a greater and greater tolerance over time to work with foreign special forces, because the Libyans hate the jihadis so much for the reasons that Ree has pointed out. So the lesser of two evils in 2011 was let's work with Islamists. The lesser of two evils in 2016 was let's work with American and French and British special forces against the jihadists, because people have seen that they've lost their country. I don't know the details and the nuances of how many guys are on the ground, but we know what's going on, and we know what happens in the Misrata Air Base and in various places in Tobruk. And I have to imagine that if we had a new prime minister of the GNA or someone who actually was stronger, he would call for even more support in that way. Siraj only is not able to call for more because he's too weak.
Yeah. True. Right there.
Hi, my name is Ayman. I'm a researcher in transitional justice. I'm interested to know your opinion about the role of the neighboring countries of Libya in either promoting or combating the presence of ISIS. Thank you.
Maybe we'll let Rhiannon take this one.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valuable question. I think the idea of, as you've mentioned, sort of reconciliation, transitional justice, this type of thing, I think is crucial to addressing some of those problems we mentioned in terms of the sort of statelessness, but the instability, the lack of governance, and a lot of the ongoing conflicts which are endemic currently in Libya. I think that the role of actors such as Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, there's a potential for them to have a very positive role, and we have seen that they have got this sort of Libya tripartite forum. They are trying to come up with a solution. No, it's not ISIS specific, but actually in a way it doesn't need to be, because I think the idea is that if you target these kind of the underlying causes of this, that will have a knock-on effect. If you have better governance in Sirte, if you have better security, then ISIS is going to find it much more difficult to gain a foothold. So I think there is a valuable role that they can play. However, as I think Karim also touched on earlier, obviously we do see the role that countries, particularly like Egypt, have in supporting one side and supporting them quite heavily. And I think that's also what Chris, you touched upon in terms of the balance is very important. So yeah, it's great if you can use the influence, and particularly someone like Tunisia that has this such strong ties between Libya and Tunisia across the border, economically as well, looking at the sort of smuggling economies and that type of thing. So I think there is a very important role that can be played, but the balance is crucial. And I think that's having a dialogue with actors on the ground, but also ensuring that you're boxing out the sort of strong arming of certain groups and providing a lot of on-the-ground military assistance, for example, which I don't think actually helps. And again, it's about maintaining that balance.
Shall I comment slightly there?
Sure.
I used to believe in the 2014-2015 period that the role of the US and the West should be to box out all of the regional actors, that they were all bad. And I don't believe that anymore. I believe something closer to what Ree said, which is that you need the regional actors because they're the ones connected to their proxies. And one of the mistakes in my mind with the UN process was Bernardino Leon invited the elected politicians of the GNC and the elected politicians of the HOR, and those are people who had no power. They were on the one hand just doing the dirty work of the militias who controlled their areas, and on the other hand they were doing the dirty work of the foreign groups in Qatar and Egypt that backed them. So the Egyptians, if they can negotiate with the Qataris, and that seems difficult right now given what's been happening in the geopolitics, that's very positive, The regional actors, when you bring them on board, when you had them support the Skhirat process, things got done. When the regional actors were only just lip servicing support, but behind their backs undermining it, nothing got done. So Egypt and Tunis and Algeria particularly have the ability, because of their intimate connections and geography, to help bring the Libyan factions that they support to the table. And the regional process and the international process should reinforce each other. We only need to box out the very destabilizing actors that are caught red-handed, arming groups in contradistinction to the embargo, or trying to get them back on the straight and narrow.
Yes, that is true if the regional actors have a clear political decision to back up the negotiations. What we have seen is that there is actors who formally say, yes, we are for the negotiation, but in reality they are tilting the balance by clandestinely, or not so hidden, arming the force. So there is a contradiction in the regional actor behavior that is what in the end undermined the success of the negotiation, the success of the Skhirat agreement. How to overcome that? We go back to the main point, which is what you said. There is the moment of the stick, and that only the United States could have enough pressure and enough power to freeze the intervention of the regional actor and push them out. In lack of this, who's going to tell the Egyptians, for whatever reason, from the most noble to the most irregular one that they can have, who's going to tell them, stay out of it, don't stop arming Haftar, stop inducing a certain part to believe that they can have a military victory? Until something like that happens, there will always be forces in the neighboring countries that will push for gaining on the ground what they cannot gain outside of it.
One way of putting this is nature abhors a vacuum. So because there's this Libyan political vacuum, it sucks in international actors.
Exactly. And this is very circular in this. It's always a catch-22 situation. Is there? Yeah.
Hi, Jared Mason, U.S. Treasury Department. You talked a little bit about doing kind of targeted, smaller scale support to institutions that are actually functioning in the country. I think that's a little bit of a hard sell in an environment where you don't have kind of a national level, any degree of national level consensus. And I'll use your example about the people managing the fiscal situation in Zawiya, for example, right? Like, certainly you could envision providing some support and assistance to them on, managing public financial resources. But at the same time, if they can't get wages paid on time, or can't get letters of credit, or some of these like very high level like national scale problems, if there's no reliability, then the amount that you can really do in that circumstance, I think, is pretty limited. So I'm wondering what you think about the scope for actual practical on the ground assistance in the absence of a larger kind of national accord.
Very, very good question.
Thanks for that, Jared. And of course, this follows up on conversations that you and I have had in private. Yes, Libya has national level problems and it has local level problems, and they're nested within each other, right? But there's a chicken and egg thing here. If you only do the national level problems and you try to just deal with the question of the fact that the letters of credit system is entirely broken, or that the black market rate of the dinar undermines the Libyan economy and has humanitarian crises, then you'd be ignoring these local level problems, like the fuel smuggling that's happening in Zawiya. I think that if you deal with some of the low-hanging fruit and some of these local level capacity programs, going back to this Zawiyan example, it strengthens the governability of Libya, which allows some of the national problems to be dealt with. But you have to do both simultaneously. And I think that that's the problem with some of the Western and UN approaches until now, is that they've exclusively worked at the national level stuff, but that, no one's home, right? Siraj doesn't have the power, or going to stuff that you know about at Treasury, the Audit Bureau is preventing the national government from spending its own budget. And therefore, of course, you can't get that national level thing done. So you have to do both things simultaneously. I mean, we're working on this all the time. What do you have to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other interesting thing, I guess, to go back to higher level stuff and the idea about getting a political consensus, I think too often in the Libyan situation, the economic realities and kind of getting economic reconciliation in a way is entirely missed out. And actually, I think that's a key part of if you're going to get long-term solutions. And yes, it is a conundrum, as you said. You kind of need bottom-up, but yes, that's limited. And as you said, you can't just have top-down. But actually, you almost need something where, you have political deal. You also need the economics underlying that, because actually, in terms of institutions, all that Libya really has that is functioning is the Central Bank of Libya and the NOC and the LIA. So I do think that's too often missed out, and also a lot of the political problems we're seeing now, which are contributing to the lack of governance, contributing to the reason that ISIS is able to get a foot in and other jihadi groups, is the economic problem. Libya has lost so much of its value of its GDP. It's really in dire straits. The dinar is plummeting. You can only get 400 dinars out of the bank. There's still queues for gas, and all of this kind of things actually are really affecting Libyans' day-to-day life. And I think that then makes all of the political stuff even more difficult, because people are like, okay, well, that's great. Siraj and Haftar are having a deal, but when am I going to get electricity back on? So I think, and again, I'm less of a sort of have less of a background on the policy stuff, so I don't know how easy it is to be able to combine the idea of this political and economic. But I do think in Libya, having the economic, how you sort of have economic equality in a way, and how the relationship between the central government and the local governments is also crucial to solving some of these longer term problems, and ultimately being able to engage.
It's a problem of how to decentralize this issue.
Yeah, exactly. It comes back to decentralization.
It needs a focus for the debate, for the discussion, the application, which in the moment is missing in it.
Yeah.
Question over there.
My name is Samar Chatterjee, Safe Foundation. I can understand that you folks who are either from the United States and Britain, your bias of the study, you didn't consider an option, in my opinion, that the Western alliance, which is United States headed with Britain, France, Italy, I guess they were the ones who destabilized finally ended Gaddafi. And the last hit was from the United States because the Europeans were unable to completely destabilize him and destroy him. So it was finally the United States had to get in. And so the big Western mafia is the one responsible. So can we isolate them, like have a triply trial of these bad guys so that they don't ever interfere in the world in any other country in this kind of a manner? And while the Libyans themselves are fighting it out among themselves to create another Gaddafi who will finally rule, next ruler of Libya, because that's what it seems to me has to happen in order for Libya to be stable.
Well, I'll jump in there. I see that as a two-part question. I couldn't disagree more on the first part, and I think most Libyans would as well, but the second part I think is very interesting. So I'll try to knock off the first one and then the second. So, you know, this notion that somehow the West overthrew Gaddafi, to me, is absolutely absurd, right? The rebels defeated Gaddafi. There was the genuine popular uprising started by Fathi Turbil in Benghazi on February 15th, and tapping into the Arab Spring and growing from when Gaddafi fired into the crowd throughout February. And this, of course, culminated in March of 2011 with the only time in history that the Arab League passed a resolution calling for the intervention of non-Arab powers militarily in the Arab world, leading to UN Resolution 1973. I have written, and I direct you to an article in The Spectator. You could get it by Googling Jason Pack, Spectator, Ethan Chorin, engagement in Libya is the right answer, that what happened in Libya was actually not an intervention. The West did not intervene in Libya. That is a mistake. And that's a misconception. Rather, we supported the sovereign actor in a process of becoming, the NTC, which required assistance. That assistance was in the form of a no-fly zone. What we didn't do, maybe we should have, what we didn't do was intervene in the evolving power dynamics, i.e. the struggles between, say, the Islamist wing of the rebel army and the more institutional or NTC wing, or the civil society activists. We absolutely did not intervene in those internal dynamics. And that's why the Libyans have been fighting it out since then. We didn't pick a winner. We didn't pick a Hamid Karzai and implant him in Libya. So the idea that, you said that the US was the one who finally kicked out Gaddafi. That's not what I experienced. I mean, not really. This was a French and British and Qatari-led mission. The US provided some important support capacities, but you have to keep in mind how reticent Obama was to be involved in anything, of course. We write about this in my book, Chapter 4 with Richard Northern of 2011 Libyan Uprisings and the Struggle for the Post-Gaddafi Future. The US was a bit player. Obviously, the French and the Qataris were the most important players, with the Brits and the Italians supporting. So I think that that's just a very wrong-headed way of thinking about it. But then you asked a question that I think is very valid. Are the Libyans waiting for a new strongman? And I'll say something brief and then kick it out to my panelists here. Maybe the Libyans are increasingly becoming fed up with the polarization and the power vacuum, whereby they would be willing to accept a new Gaddafi, to use your term. The Libyan people are not pining for a new Gaddafi, not even those from his traditional support groups, say those in the Fazan area or around Sirte. They're not pining for a new Gaddafi. Whether Saif al-Islam was or was not released last week, whether that's a rumor or a reality, Saif al-Islam is not going to be Napoleon coming back from his exile, landing in the Côte d'Azur and marching on Paris, right? So they're not pining for a new Gaddafi, but like any people, they don't want to wait in lines for groceries and gas, and they don't want the electricity to have the horrible power outages that are so ravaging the Libyan people. And if a strong man, be him Haftar or someone else, is able to some extent alleviate these issues, and whether it's through a brutal military governance, you know, and Abdul Razak al-Nasuri in the east, and he does some good things and some bad things, I can't say. But there is momentum for the idea of governance. And whether that will culminate in a new strongman, anyone's game.
Yeah, I mean, to come back to the strongman point, which I think is very interesting. I guess it comes down to that same argument of, you know, sort of stability and security versus freedom and rights. And I think it can be very easy to say, yes, everyone wants, a new strongman. And actually that's, not generally the case. There are a lot of organisations, a lot of people, a lot of activists that are really still on the ground trying to get their own point of view and their own, issues they care about and different things. So I think that can be dangerous. That also, I think, does play into what works best for Western policy, which is great. We have one guy we can just get behind and we don't need to worry about anyone else. So I think there is a sort of danger to go down the road, and also is to think that is a viable solution, I guess. But there certainly is some, Libya has been very chaotic in a lot of places. There is a great deal of instability, insecurity, and things are just not functioning. So I think it's, entirely right that people are wanting something else. And if people feel, if there's someone comes along that you feel can offer that kind of stability, then why not? But I think it's interesting what you were saying about the East. So we have seen this, in Khalifa Haftar, and this is what many people are talking about. He's a strong man. However, his military governance system in eastern Libya, it's been showing a lot of cracks recently. So it seemed to be very strong for a while. Now we're seeing a lot more internal divisions, things that appeared to be working for a while no longer are. So I think there's also the reality that even having a strong man, so to speak, will not solve Libya's problems. And to go back to Haftar as well, yes, in the east he has more control, but I don't see Haftar and I don't see anyone else that would be able to exert that kind of, strongman control without extensive support from the likes of Egypt or the UAE or on the other side, Qatar, or whoever it might be, whoever the external party might be. To be able to introduce that kind of stability. So I think it's kind of a misnomer in a sense. Yes, I'm sure there is a trend towards wanting that, but in reality, I don't really see that happening or how that would work.
And if I may say, if there is something that we have learned, is that the idea of the strongman and the strongman brings stability is an illusion. Dictators plant the seeds of their own demise, of the problem within society. You might have a few months, a year, 10 years of fake stability, but underneath all the dynamics within a society, all the contradictions, all the fact that there are no avenues for participation in your own life, they grow up and then will explode. So I don't think that the Egyptians did a great thing in resorting back to a military dictatorship, even though it appears that it's bringing some stability. We all know that it's not bringing any stability. And in Libya will be the same. God forbid, Haftar is given the power, the possibility to conquer the country. He will normalize it, but because of the fact that he will push out all the forces that we have seen acting at the moment of the revolt against Gaddafi, they will return a year or 2 years or 2 years from now.
Exactly. And to build on this, there's a plan for elections in 2018. And whether that's a pipe dream, whether there is the technical capacity to execute nationwide elections, is anyone's guess. But in those elections, Haftar and Abdul Razak al-Azuri and Saif and Fatih Bashaga should all be allowed to run, of course. So we need a centralization in Libya just as the time that we're decentralizing, because there is no central authority other than the CBL and the NOC and LIPTIC, and not even the LIA because it's contested so much. And you need something that says, aha, we need to invest in these pipelines. Or wouldn't it be great if there was a road here? Or so of course you need a central and national level of authority. And to have a political reconciliation, all these actors need to be allowed to run in the elections for that central authority. And I think a rabbit could be pulled out of a hat here, because as the dynamics are shifting, I mean, and who knows how the Qatar-UAE thing will play out, it does seem like the momentum which was gained by the UAE Haftar-Sarraj meeting a month or 2 months ago has been lost because of the Qatar-UAE fallout, and therefore there's a remilitarization of things in Libya, particularly with the fall of Jufra a week or two ago, that it looks like there's an ability of the Haftar and LNA to conquer more. But maybe this will lead to some kind of steady state and the mutually hurting stalemate that Chris was mentioning. And then the actors would come to the table and be willing to have some kind of agreement.
We have time for a couple more questions. There's one over there.
Thank you so much. I was following the flow of the discussion, and you seem to have a very accurate view of what's happening in Libya. But only one thing shocked me in your intervention. Don't you think that in Libya there were an intervention from foreign forces to destabilize Gaddafi. Like, I'm coming from Tunisia. Tunisia played a role in the fall of Gaddafi, and it was in our advantage that Gaddafi will fall because he was a threat for our revolution at the end of the day. But we opened our borders for guns and weapons. We opened our borders for people to cross to go to Libya to fight. And the relationship between the jihadists in Libya, Ansar Sharia, most of the leaders of Ansar Sharia were unfortunately coming from my country to go to Libya and then start the so-called revolution in Syria or support the rebels in Syria. So don't you think it was a clear plan of intervention in Libya that led, again, the relationship between Libya? I would like you to tell us more about the relationship of Libya and Syria and what's happening in Libya and Syria, the momentum of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and all of this, like, globally, to wrap up. Thank you.
So actually, I see that as 2 or 3 nested questions, which I'll try to address simultaneously.
I'm sorry.
I think the least interesting one is just the technicalities of how you and I define an intervention, of which intelligent people could disagree. I don't believe if a quasi-sovereign entity like the NTC or a sovereignty in becoming asks for assistance, that's an intervention. You know, so that's a technical poli-sci definition that I'm applying here, and also because of the Arab League and the UN resolution. Okay, so that's, as I said, a technical poli-sci question. Do I think that outside actors were instrumental in leading to the fall of the Gaddafi regime? Of course. If there was no 1973 and no no-fly zone, Gaddafi would have steamrolled through Benghazi on March 17, March 18, March 19. I don't necessarily think that he would have exterminated the Libyan people like rats, as he said he would. But yes, there would have been a neo-authoritarianism and a crushing of the rebels, for sure. That doesn't mean that the support mission was an intervention. Yes, it tipped the scales. So let's finish that as question 1. I think the more interesting question that you asked was what I'll call question 2 and question 3. Question 2 was about the role of jihadi groups and particularly Tunisian recruitment in shaping the Libyan reality. And then question 3 is how that played out in the Levant and the role of Tunisia and Libya as jumping off points for the attempt to change the Assad regime in Syria. And I'm so happy to have this question because this is exactly what we discuss in our report, right? That there is no jihadism in Libya in isolation. As we know from what's called the Sinjar records discovered in 2006 in Iraq, Derna was the city per capita that had the most jihadis fighting in Iraq. And those networks between Derna and the Levant have remained active. And yes, there were whole brigades, for example, the Battar Brigade that you might be familiar with, who went from fighting in Libya to instantly fighting in Syria. And Abdul Hakim Bilhaj, as soon as his guys wrapped up the conquest of Tripoli, he said, now you're trained, go to Syria. And one of the things that we talk about in the report is the reverse. People who fought in Syria, and we called that the undergrad for jihad, they went to Libya to get their postgrad degree in jihad. And why is it a postgrad? Because the undergrad, gives you a broad overview. The postgrad teaches you to branch out on your own and to implement what you've learned, right? That's what the master's degree is supposed to do. And by coming from what they gathered in Syria to their postgrad in Derna and Sirte, they founded their own brigades. They mostly Tunisian jihadis who had first been in Syria, then coming back to Libya on their way home or as another transition. These were the groups who were very productive in mutating constantly in Derna and Sirte. So the porosity of the Tunisian-Libyan border has been a real plague for Libya. And it's been a plague for Tunisia, obviously, with the attacks that happened at the Barda Museum and at the British holidaymakers in Sousse. And there is this dynamic between the fact that it's very difficult for Tunisian jihadis to train in Tunisia, but it's very easy for them to get training in Libya, so they can get their, grad degrees there, and then maybe come back to Tunis or Europe. This is a very complex dimension that we're constantly monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, Jason's covered most of the main points there, but also coming back to what you were saying, sort of linking to the Muslim Brotherhood, and I think what's interesting currently what's happening as well with the regional dynamics, we're seeing the move against Qatar and others and the Muslim Brotherhood. I suppose at a more political level in Libya recently, what we're seeing in terms of the more hardline Islamist factions, militias, and those that sort of allied with them that are being increasingly boxed out, or have been in the last few weeks, and both militarily, so the sort of losses to the Benghazi defence brigades has fallen into that. In Tripoli, we've seen in the last month as well, the likes of Khalifa al-Khayal and his Libyan National Guard, and others who have been sort of driven out to Tripoli. We're seeing many more rifts within Misrata because of these divides between the I suppose the more hardline Islamists and not. So I think that's a very interesting dynamic to see how that will play into what happens with some of the jihadi groups in Libya, because some of these entities, yes, they are allied with jihadis, not all of them are themselves, but I think there's then this danger that if you are pushed more and more to the fringes, there's then going to be a comeback. There's reports of groups already sort of moving around Tripoli, and no one's quite sure what's going on there, but to sort of re-spark more conflict. And so, in some ways, it's good that some of this funding has been cut off, but I think that's an interesting dynamic that feeds into what's happening with jihadi groups and the militias on the ground as well.
I think there have been some interesting and important questions asked about the West's and NATO's culpability in getting us where we are in Libya today. I think it's important that we ask those questions. NATO has made a lot of mistakes in Libya. The most important of which was underestimating how difficult security would be after Gaddafi fell. The idea, however, that NATO was somehow sitting around and eagerly looking for Middle Eastern authoritarian leaders to overthrow is 100% against the factual record. The fact of the matter is that NATO went into Libya very reluctantly, and only in the face of what would likely have been a humanitarian catastrophe. It did end up supporting the rebels in their overthrow of Gaddafi, although it took them a long time to decide that they even wanted to do that. So it's important to bear this in mind, I think, when we go back and look at the historical record. The bigger historical question about whether or not NATO's involvement in Libya has significantly made the situation worse. My own view of that is that things would be pretty bad in Libya today, even if NATO hadn't intervened. We have a case in point in Syria, which is a country where there hasn't been a NATO intervention. There have been many foreign interventions, of course, but there's been no constructive effort to try and intervene in order to bring the conflict to an end. And you see what happens there. So regardless of whether or not you think that NATO was helpful in Libya, you have to do the counterfactual and ask, well, what would have happened if NATO hadn't have intervened in the first place? I think likely we would be in a similar position to the one that we're in anyway today. So I just wanted to make that point as a historical point of order.
I couldn't agree more.
We are finishing our time, so I'd like to have a wrap-up moment regarding jihadism and what we have learned through this report and through our experience about the phenomenon in Libya. We'll start with Jason and we continue to...
So, I think that Libya is an important test case for looking at jihadism elsewhere, and it's an important test case for looking at ISIS as opposed to other groups. We talked about the mutability of jihadis. We talked about their cell structure. One thing I don't think we touched on is that, in my mind, Libyan jihadis differ from Syrian or Yemeni or Iraqi jihadis in as much as they don't want to overthrow the state. ISIS in its heartlands in Raqqa and Mosul very clearly wishes to overthrow the Assad regime and replace it. It wishes to establish an Islamic state. I think in Libya, these groups are parasitical. They understand that Libya is a wealthy place, but that they will never be able to export its oil or tap into its sovereign wealth because the international community won't let them, and there is a whole range of resolutions and sanctions. Therefore, they want to keep the Libyan state weak and parasite off of it. And we didn't talk as much about finances because it's not the way that the Q&A evolved, but that's something to keep in mind, which is the way in which ISIS and jihadi groups in Libya are trying to prevent the Libyan state from getting strong enough to defeat them, but they don't want it to completely collapse so that there's no central bank that can write checks and pay salaries and subsidize goods that then jihadis will smuggle and make money off of. So that's a point that I wanted to toss out there. And then to wrap up, the phenomenon of jihadism in Libya is not going anywhere because, as we've heard today, statelessness is the disease and the jihadis are the symptom or the end product. And as there are new kinds of statelessness and things are happening in the south as opposed to in Sirte or Derna, those local situations, the jihadis will insert themselves and work with the Tebu and not the Tuareg, or the Awlad Suleiman and not the Tebu, just as they were able to work with some tribes and not the Furjan in Sirte. So we're dealing with very smart, very mutable actors, and it requires a granularity of knowledge to understand what they're doing, hence the idea of the deep dive Ion ISIS look at things.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose another key point just to make, I mean, Jason's already said, you know, the way that we view the jihadist problem is that it's a symptom and not the cause of what's happening in Libya. Therefore, in order to solve the threat that ISIS and other jihadi groups pose within Libya and externally, needs a longer-term political and economic solution, as we've talked about. And I think the other thing which links into that is that you cannot purely defeat ISIS, whether in Libya, whether elsewhere globally, through purely counter-terror movements. And I think that's particularly relevant for myself. I'm British. In the UK, we're having a big discussion about this moment. We've obviously suffered quite a lot of attacks recently, and this is very much on the agenda, how you deal with these sort of attacks at home. And you know, there's a lot of more demands, so we have to have much stronger security, much more counter-terror efforts. But in the case of Libya, and I believe this applies to elsewhere as well, that will not solve anything. You know, what we're seeing with ISIS currently, they haven't got any more territory. They are still able to have training. They can mutate into other groups. They can move around the desert. Libya's a huge, you know, mainly unpopulated in most of the areas in the desert country. So purely counter-terror operations will not prevent this. And the way that the jihadist networks work currently, not only in Libya, but as we've seen with fighters going from Europe and elsewhere to fight in the Levant, everything is sort of intermutable, which is the point we've made. Everything is much more online. People can get access to this information, access to contact. So so that's the main point I would stress, that counter-terror, you know, some military solutions have some place, but that will never end the sort of threat that the ISIS poses within Libya and externally.
So over the course of 2016, the Islamic State globally lost about half of its territory and about half of the population that it controlled. I think we can expect that that trend is likely to continue. It may be slow. We will see them eventually lose the vast majority, if not all, of the population that they control in Iraq and Syria. There'll be some holdouts elsewhere in the world. I think you're going to see the same process in Libya. We've already seen the same process in Libya. You had the Islamic State holding territory in Sirte. It was effectively taken care of more or less over the course of 2016. I would be surprised if they managed to hold territory for any significant amount of time in Libya. Much more likely they're going to pursue a clandestine strategy that will put them in a position not only to continue to work to destabilize Libya, but also to conduct terrorist attacks in Europe, elsewhere in the region, and potentially, although it's a lower risk, in the United States. The good news, the bad news about the Islamic State holding territory is obviously you cannot allow a group with that kind of an ideology to hold territory and build the structures of a state, because it becomes a big threat. However, it's much, much easier to target a group that holds territory and fights as a conventional military. So now that it's transitioning to a clandestine organization, it's going to be much more difficult to have the kind of success that we've had over the course of the last year and a half. The bottom line, therefore, I think, is that in Libya and elsewhere, you're going to see the Islamic State continue. It's going to continue to be a problem. And I think we're going to have to continue to do everything that we can to stay on top of it.
Thank you very much. This has been a very rich and informative discussion. I'm very grateful for all of you. Please join me in thanking the panelists. And thank you very much for your time.